The following information is presented for discussion and educational purposes only and is not intended or provided as treatment information for any specific person or behavior. If you or a loved one is having behavioral difficulties, you are encouraged to seek professional consultation as soon as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 25, part 2 of our Timeout special with Ask the Behavior Doctors. My name is Dr. Jacob Bonet. I'm the owner and clinical director here at Scottsdale Pediatric Behavioral Services in Scottsdale, Arizona. So today in our part 2 special for Timeout, we are going to talk about specific recommendations for implementation of Timeout, and we're going to help you problem solve and troubleshoot some of those issues you might be having when implementing Timeout. So a general process for having a good Timeout procedure is, number one, set the rules. Make sure your child knows exactly what the rules are. The rules should be simple, 3 to 5 rules tops. The rules should be so simple that your child should be able to repeat them. This is a good kind of point to make here is Timeout should be implemented with children that understand expressively and receptively what you're trying to communicate to them. They should understand, have a basic concept of what Timeout is, and they should have the basic compliance skills to go to Timeout willingly and ably. So this is my point. If your child's like 1.5, has no type of receptive language skills, doesn't really have compliance yet, doesn't understand directions, you're not going to want to use Timeout. So children typically probably need to be at least about 2 years old, unless your child's super advanced before that, about that 2-year-old mark for you to use it. Okay, so you got to set the rules. Remember, rules should be quick, simple. Child should be able to repeat the rules to you. You want to catch your children being good. You're going to look for them. Try to look for them doing good things. However, if you see a naughty behavior, you're going to act fast. Pull the trigger quickly. You are able to do a warning, but I only want you to do one, and I'll talk about that. Only in specific scenarios should you do a warning. Other times, just literally pull the trigger and bring your child to timeout. You want to make timeout boring and make time in as stimulating as possible. And then the 5th step is just stay calm, stay neutral. Don't have a reaction, be consistent, okay? So with those kind of recommendations in mind, let's talk about some specifics of planning timeout. So you really kind of want to pick some target behaviors. Remember those rules, 3 to 5. You can't get perfect behavior all the time. You shouldn't put your child in timeout for every naughty behavior they do. And they have to know what behaviors you expect from them. So this is where that setting the rules thing comes in. So let's say the rules are simple as follow directions, keep your hands to yourself, share toys. Those are simple rules. Kids should be able to understand those and repeat those basically back to you. If your child violates one of those rules, then you can say, if you break that rule, you're going to go to timeout. Okay, you don't need to get into a big, long discussion. You don't need to process this with your child. If the time-in environment is super stimulating, and every time your child breaks a rule and has to go to super boring timeout, you don't need to tell them a word. They're going to get it. They're going to get that engaging in that behavior results in loss of that super awesome time-in environment. That's exactly the link you want to build between response and consequence. You don't need a big, drawn, long explanation, okay? All right, so you want to determine the length of your timeout. You know, there's that kind of a wives' tale that for every age or for every year old your child is, that's the minute you should use for timeout. It has no basis in research. They found no difference really with that rule. Short intervals can be just as effective for long intervals. If you want to use that as a rule of thumb, you can. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm just saying there's no special research to show that that's like the perfect time limit to use for timeout. The general rule of thumb is for behaviors that occur more frequently, you should use shorter lengths of timeout. And for behaviors that occur less frequently, you should use longer durations for timeout. We should probably keep those durations roughly from 2 to 15 minutes in length, okay? I typically will go in increments of like 3, 5, 10, and 15. It really just depends on the type of behavior, the severity of the behavior. Remember, if it occurs more frequently, shorter durations are probably indicated, less frequently, longer durations. Okay, so the contingencies of timeout. So you definitely want to have a plan of how long you're going to keep your child in that timeout. But the second thing is you want to plan the type of timeout. So there's time-based timeout contingencies, and then there's response, what I like to call performance-based timeout contingencies. So time-based is literally you have to stay in timeout for this long a time. As soon as you're done with your time, you're out, okay? However, I like the other type of timeout, which is called response-based timeout, which is you have to engage in this appropriate response behavior for this amount of time, and as soon as you do it, you get out. So for example, let's say I have a child who is being disruptive. I can put the child in timeout and I can say, as soon as you have a quiet mouth for 1 whole minute, I'm gonna let you out of timeout. As soon as I hear you being quiet, I'm gonna start the timer. If you make a noise, I'm gonna stop the timer. And I'm only gonna start the timer again when you're quiet. So as soon as you're quiet for 1 whole minute, you get to be out of timeout. Okay, that's performance-based. The reason I prefer response performance-based over time-based is that you're emphasizing the behavior and making your child practice that behavior, the adaptive behavior that you want. With time-based, think about it. Your child could cry, scream, throw a tantrum, throw a fit, especially if your duration's 10 or 15 minutes. And then all of a sudden, if you let them out of there, out of timeout, back into the reinforcing environment, and then they just engaged in 10 to 15 minutes of awful behavior, is that really the link you want to build? So for me, I clearly prefer, and I've clearly seen with my patients in my clinical experience, that response performance-based timeouts are the most effective. So remember, what you want to do is you want to pick the target behavior, the naughty behavior that got your child into timeout, and you want to make your child do the positive opposite. So if they were disruptive, have them be quiet. If they were hitting, have them have nice hands. If they were using naughty words, you can make them be quiet and use nice words. Just pick the positive opposite of the naughty behavior and make them do that behavior for a specified amount of time. Now, my recommendation is that you do only start the timer when they start engaging in the adaptive behavior, and that any instance of them doing the naughty behavior, you stop the timer. Okay. Now, there is some research about resetting the timer and doing all of that stuff. I don't want you to worry about that yet, so I don't want you to have to reset the clock back to 0 if your child does it. I just stop the timer, and as soon as they start being appropriate again, start the timer back. Now, the general rule of thumb is that I use is the more offenses your child builds, then you can successively build a time duration to that. So let's say your child does the behavior early in the morning and they get a 3-minute timeout. Well, let's say they continue to do the behavior, okay? Well, you might want to increase that time duration to 5 minutes. And remember, I'm going to make them do the adaptive behavior for 5 minutes before I let them out of timeout, before they earn access back to the time-in environment. And then I would go, like I said, probably to 10 minutes and then to 15 minutes. So if your child continues to reoffend or exhibit the behavior, you might want to increase that time duration up to that 15-minute mark. If your child, again, ever needs more than 5 or 10 timeout procedures in a day, especially more than 10, you probably need to stop doing it, go back to the drawing board, and figure out something better to do, okay? So you're going to want to pick whether you use that time-based or response-based. You're also going to want to pick whether you use exclusionary or non-exclusionary. So I'll tell you this, the easiest thing to do is non-exclusionary. Just keep your child in the current environment where you can see them, where you can watch them, and then you can put them in a chair in the corner if you want, or you can literally just have them sit in the side. You really do want them typically to see how fun the time-in environment is, and that is the benefit of non-exclusionary timeout, so that you can have your child see that. Now, the reasons you may want to consider consider exclusionary is if your child's doing disruptive behaviors and getting any type of attention at all, you want to prevent what's called bootleg reinforcement from other children, from other parents. So you really want to limit the amount of attention your child's getting. Exclusionary timeout is great for that, okay? So I typically start with non-exclusionary timeout. And then if I need to, because of the environment, so meaning if your child's getting tons of bootleg reinforcement, if they are still getting any kind of access to any type of reinforcement in that environment and you can't completely remove the reinforcement, that's where exclusionary timeout would probably be indicated, okay? You wanna make sure your timeout area, your timeout room, wherever your child's in timeout is totally free of preferred stimuli. You want it to be as boring and non-stimulating as possible. You literally want your child to sit there thinking, this is useless. There's no benefit to being here. I want to go back into that time and environment so bad that I'm willing to do just about anything to get there. It's exactly what you want your child to be thinking. You literally want you don't want it to be miserable, but you do want it to be boring, super boring. And you want to make it clear to your child exactly what it's going to take to get out. So again, hey, as soon as mommy hears you being quiet for 3 whole minutes, I'm going to start that timer as soon as I hear you being quiet. And as soon as you've been quiet for 3 whole minutes, you get to come out and come back to the time in environment. Okay, your child has to know what they need to do to get back to the time in environment. All right, so now we're going to problem solve a little bit here. We're going to troubleshoot. Now that I've told you that once you set your time criteria, once you set whether it's a time-based or response, performance-based, remember I prefer performance-based, and then once you make sure it's either exclusionary or non-exclusionary, and then you follow through with that, we're gonna help you troubleshoot right now. Okay, so the first problem is my child likes timeout. So remember, we're going back to that point I made in video 1. We gotta think of function. If your child really seems to like timeout, then you may not be using timeout appropriately, or timeout may be the wrong thing to do. So remember, timeout is useful for what's called positively reinforced behaviors. So things that are maintained by attention or access to people, items, or privileges. That's what timeout is super effective for. If your child is trying to get access to something, or if your child's trying to get your attention, or your child's trying to get a special privilege, like access to the TV or something, that's when timeout is super useful. What it's not useful for is the opposite, which is called negatively reinforced behaviors. So for example, if your child's trying to escape any kind of demands, escape from you, really get away from some kind of stimulus that you're presenting or something in the environment, that's the way wrong time to use timeout. You do not want to use timeout for negatively reinforced behaviors. Okay? So remember, if your child's engaging in any kind of behavior to get away from an environment or from a stimulus, you do not want to use timeout. All right? And again, we want to make timeout as boring as possible so your child doesn't enjoy it. We don't want you to show any emotion. We want you to be as neutral as possible. This goes back to the point of timeout should not be super aversive as far as, it should not be a traumatizing experience. You should not be screaming at your child. They should not be screaming at you. This should be something that you're just implementing. And you're literally, your mindset is, hey son, I'm not mad at you, buddy, but as soon as you're a good boy, you're gonna get to come to this awesome time and environment. You know what, man? I hope you make good choices, because as soon as you do, we get to go to time in together. But unfortunately, you made a bad choice, so you're in timeout right now, but you're gonna make good choices and you're gonna get back to that time in environment. That should be your mindset with timeout. All right. Limit access to rewards or reinforcers if you think your child's obviously enjoying it. You want to prevent any bootleg. Remember, make the environment as boring and stimulus-free as possible. If your child is self-stimming, so if they're doing something to self-stimulate, any kind of rocking, touching, playing with a ball, whatever, you want to remove that or block that as much as possible. Do not let your child engage in preferred activities. Parents, sometimes I see parents use a bedroom as a timeout environment. It's a problem if the child's bedroom, they have access to all of their toys and everything. Also too, using the bedroom as a timeout environment is typically that environment, we want their child to like their bedroom. So if that's also their timeout environment, you're sending a very mixed message. I typically do not recommend using the bedroom as the timeout environment. Only use that if it's the least stimulating part of the environment and it's the only place that will prevent access to bootleg reinforcement. Okay. Also, again, consider contingent observation. Give the access child view of what's going on in the time in environment. You do want your child to be super motivated to get back to time in. So if they can see it and they can see something fun and exciting going on in time in, they are going to be more motivated to get back to it quickly, which is exactly what you want. Because if they're super motivated to get back to it quickly, they're probably going to engage in their best behaviors to get there as soon as possible. All right, so time in is boring, not rewarding. So this is a big problem I see. We got to troubleshoot this. You got to think of ways to make time in as stimulating as possible. You need to provide lots of preferred access to items. You need to provide a diverse set of stimuli. You need to provide things or attention or something that is really, really valuable. Here's the problem. If time in is always going to be super boring, then you're never going to have much success with time out because it's just not going to be different enough. If you want super different behaviors between the conditions, you need to have super different contingencies between the conditions. So again, I know I've belabored this point, time in has to be way more fun and stimulating than time out. If it's not, then you need to think of ideas to increase the amount of reinforcers, the amount of attention, the amount of stimulation, or the amount of self-play options in that environment. My child does not go willingly to timeout. Oh, this is a very common one. Okay, so typically what I recommend to parents is you provide a choice. You can provide a choice to your child. So, you know what, buddy? We're currently in timeout. If you can walk to timeout by yourself, or you can go like a big boy, you'll only have to stay for 2-3 minutes. If I have to bring you to timeout, you're gonna have to stay for 5 minutes or 10 whole minutes, okay? So what you're doing is you're providing a choice, but you're making the choice of going willingly and by himself much more attractive. And you're making the choice of, if I have to prompt you or physically bring you to timeout, you're gonna have to stay and perform the desired behavior much longer. So basically you're manipulating response effort. You're saying if you make a good choice, you'll get to stay much less and it'll be much quicker. However, if you make the wrong choice, it's gonna take you a lot more effort to get back to that time in environment. So you wanna consider manipulating that. Physically guide your child as gently as possible. You're not mad, take all of the anger out of your demeanor. Take it out of your physical kind of state. Remember, you're like a robot. You should go cold. You should be neutral. You should not feel anger or upset. Remember, your child is just a child. All they've made is a poor choice. Your job, you should be excited that you get an opportunity to teach them how to make good choices. And that's got to be your mindset. There's no such thing as a bad child. There's children who just have poor skills and make poor choices, but your job as an instructor is to teach them how to make great choices and how to improve those skills. That's your job as a parent. And that's what you're doing when you're being consistent and implementing these procedures consistently. If your child is unmanageable or is too big to physically guide or too dangerous or is engaging in behaviors that are too dangerous to guide, create a temporary timeout area around them. You can consider getting some kind of screen. I know you've seen those screens where you can change your clothes behind. Prevent access to attention. Literally create the timeout environment around that child. That's fine. Again, if they're too disruptive or too big, you can implement timeout without having to bring them to a place. Just make as much of the attention or as much of the reinforcement move away from them as possible. If your child is in the condition where they're just too hard to move or it's too dangerous. I don't have a room for timeout. Again, this is a problem we hear frequently. Remember, timeout is not about space or a room. All you need to do is you can use a barrier to block access to attention, or you can remove all of that attention away from the child, or you can put some kind of signal up that your child's in a timeout condition. So for example, in classrooms, you can use like a red dot, a green dot, a blue dot, a red dot, something. Blue means your child's in a time in condition, red means your child's in a timeout condition. The only reason you use a signal is so that everyone in that environment responds to your child consistently. If your child is in a timeout condition, you need to make sure others do not dilute that condition by giving attention or giving access to anything. So that's the only reason you want to use some kind of signal. Put it on the wall, do whatever you got to do. Just make sure everybody that's around that child knows that that child is in a timeout condition. Okay. My child does not stay in timeout. All right, so you do want to prevent your child from leaving timeout. You do want to only use exclusionary timeout if you know your child's capable of staying in exclusionary timeout. If they're not, you're going to need to either implement a non-exclusionary timeout procedure, or you're going to need to stay there and make sure they do stay in that environment consistently. At some point, your child does need to stay where you direct them to stay. That is a basic compliance skill. It's a basic safety skill. Think about it. If they won't stay in an environment that you tell them to stay in, that's a skill we need to build at some point. So my advice to parents is, we do need to teach your child how to stay where they need to stay sometimes. So this will involve you standing close to the door, let's say if you put them in their bedroom, and prompting them back to that environment. And what you're reminding them, by the way, because you're using performance-based timeout procedures, you're reminding them that the clock doesn't start till you stay in this bedroom. I'll play this game all day with you, son. If I have to bring you back to this bedroom, that timer is not going to start. Son, you are literally wasting your time in that time-in environment by continually trying to leave this space. If you keep leaving it, I'm just going to bring you back to it. And again, you may want to consider, if they repeatedly move from the environment, you may want to consider, okay, if I have to put you back in the room again, that means you're going to have 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes. If that's what you have to do, then that's what you need to do. Remember, you are going beyond just the basic timeout concept. You're teaching your child a safety skill. Children sometimes, for their absolute safety, have to stay where you direct them to stay. If your child is not capable of that, that is a huge problem. They need to have that skill. Again, you can reset the timer. Right now, I don't recommend. The research, again, is kind of inconclusive on resetting the timer. I just like stopping the timer. As soon as your child's doing the appropriate behavior, you can set the timer back. My child is too old for timeout. I hear this a lot. Again, timeout's not a space. Timeout can just mean removal of privileges. Let's say, for example, your child is driving. They're 16. And let's say they come home 2 hours past curfew and they were with their friends. Okay? So a timeout intervention could be, okay, I'm really disappointed you came home late. So you can only use the car to go see your friends once you've come home consecutively 3 days on time from school. So if you get home by 6 p.m., 3 days consecutively, I'll give you the car back so that you can drive to go see your friends. Again, that's the perfect performance-based timeout procedure. You are removing the stimulus of friends, you're removing that reinforcement, that privilege, but you're making access to that privilege, again, contingent upon performance of being on time 3 consecutive days in a row. If your child finds those friends, that time-in environment, super reinforcing, they're going to be very motivated to come home on time those 3 consecutive days. So again, this is an example of how to use timeout without having to put your child in a naughty chair or put them in a room. The last issue is too many warnings or no follow-through. I hear parents threaten timeout a lot. They'll say, oh, that's it, you're going to go to timeout, and this is where I'll cover that warning concept. You are only allowed to give warnings for timeout if those warnings decrease the target behavior. So this is my point. If your child is disruptive, and every time your child is disruptive, you provide a warning, and they still continue to be disruptive every single time, then guess what? Your warning is not effective. It's not helpful. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. You should give at most 1 warning for each target behavior that you're going to bring your child to timeout for. If they continue to do it past that warning, that's it. Bam, act quickly. Bring them to timeout, set the criteria, be consistent, stay calm. That's the steps for doing that, okay? So again, if you do give too many warnings or you have no follow through, then you need to change that. You need to be more consistent. You need to have a better plan. You need to have a more sanitized timeout environment, and you need to be more consistent in your implementation of that. If your child attempts to escape or they're non-compliant with requests to go to timeout, you need to physically guide them to it. You need to stay there with them. Or you need to put them in an environment that's much more difficult to escape from. Okay? You need to make sure you're teaching them that when you say to go somewhere and stay there, that that's what they need to do. And that as soon as they do that appropriate behavior, they'll get to go right back to that awesome time-in environment. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today. I hope these ideas for how to troubleshoot and how to appropriately use timeout make your timeout procedures much more effective. I do encourage you that if you have tried timeout and it has failed, or if you are not seeing success after these recommendations with using timeout, I encourage you to consult a professional behavior specialist like myself. Again, we're here in Scottsdale, Arizona at Scottsdale Pediatric Behavioral Services. I want to thank you for joining us here today. I want you to continue submitting those questions to us at info@scottsdalepbs.com. We want to thank our photographer, Mr. Philip Carnevale of philipcarnevalephotography.com. We want to thank you again for submitting those questions and for joining us here at Scottsdale Pediatric Behavioral Services and Ask the Behavior Doctors.